Hi everybody, Professor H here. In this video, we're going to take a look at Chapter 3, Part 3, Caring for the Neonate. So I'm going to go ahead and do our screen share and we'll get started. I hope everybody is doing well. I know things are a little bit wild out there these days, but we'll just have to take deep breaths and hang on and do the best we can. Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is our title page. Basically, we're going to be taking a look at nutrition, talking a lot about breastfeeding versus bottle feeding, social and emotional aspects of neonatal care, and we're going to talk a little bit about postpartum depression. All right. I'm going to go ahead and I'll just leave the camera up. What the heck? So we're going to start off with the historical and cultural evidence for breastfeeding. Humans, like other mammals, have innate kind of instinctual things that go on with our bodies. We have the reflexes that occur at birth, like other mammals, that prepare our body to be able to breastfeed the young. We have early on in pregnancy, we start to have a multiplying of the mammary glands, and then they become mature kind of early on during pregnancy. And at birth, we have something called the letdown reflex. At birth, the milk will, sometimes they say, oh, the milk is dropping or the milk is letting down. And that is when the mother's breasts start to leak milk and things like that. That can occur before birth even. But generally, you see this right out about the time of birth. You don't want to actually start leaking that out before you give birth because you might lose colostrum, which is a very important thing we're going to talk about later. Interestingly, we have some instinctive things that occur with humans, just like animals. When a mother hears her baby cry, oftentimes that letdown reflex happens, and what happens is the breast starts to release milk. Women often have to wear pads when they are breastfeeding. They're a pad that covers their nipple that will absorb the leakage. Because if you hear a baby cry, you see the open mouth on a baby, or you think about feeding the baby. Those are things that can trigger that letdown reflex and start the milk to flow. There is historical and cultural evidence for breastfeeding. We know that in traditional cultures, the infants are often bound to the mom and they frequently feed throughout the day and the night. In other words, the mom might be carrying the baby on their back or some type of apparatus on their front, but the babies are often kind of strapped to the mom throughout the day. This makes it really easy for a mom to just go ahead and bring the baby to the breast and feed them anytime during the day or night when the baby is hungry. Anthropologists believe that through 99% of human history, this is how it's been done, that moms just kind of carry that baby or have them with them and that they breastfeed that baby as needed throughout the day. In most cultures, breastfeeding is common for 2 to 3 years. So for the first 2 to 3 years. Of course, you know, the first year it's a whole lot of breastfeeding, and then it would be more intermittent in the 2 and 3-year-olds. And that is in traditional cultures in most of the world. Historically, there have been periods of time where women were employing wet nurses. That would be a lactating woman who will breastfeed their baby for them. A lot of the higher class women did not want to be, it was not thought that you had to be the one to breastfeed this child. You could hire a wet nurse, they could take care of this baby for you. Oftentimes, it was a widespread practice throughout recorded history. This is something that was going on in 1700s. It was booming. There was a booming wet nurse kind of industry where women were often employed as wet nurses. Throughout history, there have also been substitutions for breast milk. For example, there are a lot of periods of time where people have used goat's milk, cow's milk, or even camel's milk to feed their children. Say the mom was not producing enough milk, or something happened to the mother and you had to somehow try to supplement this child. These are not good substitutes for breast milk. They are not nutritionally sufficient for the baby. So although these things have been used throughout history, they are not a good substitute for breast milk. We have some interesting images on this slide. Formula is the replacement for breast milk. In the early days of breast milk replacements, for example, in the late 1800s in the West, condensed milk and evaporated milk were commonly used instead of breast milk. The companies that produced these products put out false claims saying that it was more convenient, it's cleaner, and it's safer for your baby. In addition, doctors were paid to persuade moms to use these substitutes for breast milk. Condensed milk and evaporated milk were not very good nutritionally for babies. Later on, the formulas became better and more nutritionally balanced. By 1940, only 20 to 30% of women breastfed babies. So this campaign that was done in the West to get women to use these substitutes instead of breastfeeding came with a stigma also that, basically it's uncool to breastfeed your baby. You should be bottle feeding them because it's better for them, which was not true. This trend lasted through the 1970s. Currently, breastfeeding is back on the rise, and this is due to the information that is out there about breastfeeding. It has been promoted, and health agencies have tried to educate women about breastfeeding so that they can make educated decisions about what they feed their babies. These days, our infant formulas are also very healthy for our children. So if a mother chooses to feed formula, their child is going to be healthy and safe, just as a child that is breastfed. And those decisions women have to make based on their own situations. In Northern Europe, breastfeeding is almost universal. In the West, where we are, things that increase the likelihood that a mother will breastfeed are a mother's age. Older women tend more to breastfeed, higher education level, and higher socioeconomic status. These things will increase the likelihood of breastfeeding in developed countries. The other trends that we see in developed countries are ethnic trends. We see that Latinos have about an 80% breastfeeding rate. 80% will breastfeed, whites only 75%, and African American only 58%. Basically, of these women who breastfeed, less than half breastfeed for longer than 6 months. The World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for 2 years. And once again, there's a lot of reasons why in Western society people do not always breastfeed their children. We're going to start off just talking about the benefits of breastfeeding your child. However, you want to remember that there are benefits to breastfeeding, but breastfeeding is not going to be for everybody. And once again, it is a mom's decision to make for whatever is going to work best for the mom and her situation, whether to choose bottle feeding or breastfeeding, using a formula or using the breastfeeding. Either one is going to lead to a good outcome in the West, where we have clean water, good health care, that sort of thing. So there are some benefits to breastfeeding. These benefits that we're going to talk about are very small correlations. If you can remember, correlations do not mean causations. We are not saying that specifically because these children are breastfed that we see these benefits. We are just saying we think there is a relationship between these benefits and breastfeeding. There are improvements in physical and cognitive well-being. There have been studies that show that IQ points are up by 6 points in breastfed children. And once again, this is a correlation. Are there other factors that could lead to this increase in IQ points? Sure. We're talking about mothers that are higher educated, older, and oftentimes higher socioeconomic status. So those things might also contribute as well. There is no evidence of emotional or social relationship benefits for breastfeeding. So the closeness, that bonding, those types of things can occur just as well when a person uses formula and bottle feeds as they can when they are breastfeeding the child. And once again, the World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for 2 years. And breastfeeding is, the importance of breastfeeding in the West is, Western cultures or developed nations is very different than in developing countries. In developing countries, it is very important to encourage women to breastfeed their babies, and we'll talk about why. Real quickly, this is a graph that or a little chart that shows some benefits of breastfeeding. For the child, disease protection. That initial milk that you give the child has colostrum in it, which has a lot of antibodies, proteins, things like that, which help with disease protection. Cognitive development, as I mentioned previously, there are studies that show increases in IQ for breastfeeding, but once again, that's not causal, that is a correlation. There is a relationship between children who are breastfed and obesity, that children who are breastfed have lower rates of obesity. And overall long-term health benefits, long-term health has been, in some studies, correlated to breastfeeding as well, that there is better long-term health consequences for those that are breastfed compared to those that are not. Once again, these are not causal factors, they are correlations. For the mom, breastfeeding can improve uterine health. After you give birth, when that baby starts breastfeeding, this releases a lot of oxytocin, which induces contractions. These little contractions are going to help shrink that uterus back up to where it's supposed to be. It will just bring everything back down a lot quicker when you breastfeed. Also, when you are breastfeeding, the mother has a easier time getting back to their pre-pregnancy weight. And there are long-term health benefits. There's correlations between reduced breast cancer and I'm not sure, I think uterine cancer, but definitely reduced breast cancer incidence for mothers who breastfeed. So there are some strong, some correlations. They're not necessarily strong correlations, but they are relationships that we see. All right, so there are many obstacles to somebody breastfeeding. Some of the obstacles, this is a image of a person, and does it say where this is? Yes. Benefits of breastfeeding are especially important in developed countries where risk to early development are higher. Here in Waru, a Waru mother in Venezuela nurses her baby. And you can see the kind of environment that they are in. It is a very probably low socioeconomic status. You can see everything is flooded. There's trash everywhere. So for this baby to breastfeed would be really important because there's probably not good access to clean water where this mom lives. So breastfeeding could be a life or death difference for her baby. So problems with breastfeeding, let me peek up here a minute. Nope, okay. Problems with breastfeeding with babies that are low birth weight. They may have difficulty latching on. In other words, gripping that nipple and being able to suck hard enough, because it is harder for them to get milk out of a breast than it is out of a bottle. So sometimes low birth weight babies have difficulty with that. Some women have a difficult time producing enough milk. So if they are not able to produce enough milk, the baby may need to be supplemented or changed over, depending on what their situation is. There are employment, as some women also have extreme pain during nursing. A lot of people, it's nothing, like, you know, I was an old milk heifer, like a little milk cow, no problem. But I'm just lucky. I feel like I'm very lucky because of that. Some women have extreme pain when nursing and just don't produce well. Employment is another factor. Women who, you know, oftentimes people do not have enough time off, number one, when they are having their babies and trying to get things set up. They may have to go back to work. This baby may have to go into daycare, or relatives may have to care for this baby. And in that case, you may need to supplement with formula, or you can breast pump. Sometimes if you produce a lot of milk, like my personal situation, I was able to produce a lot of milk. So I was able to breastfeed, store it. When I went to work, I could leave that with my mom or with the father, and either my husband could feed the baby or my mom would be able to feed the baby while I was gone. And in a workplace, you may not be able to just step out and pump. I know legally you're supposed to be able to have stations set up so that you can breast pump. You're supposed to be able to do that. That not just sit in a bathroom stall and do it. You're supposed to have a place that you can do that. However, a lot of workplaces do not seem to make this readily available to moms. So that's another reason why it can be very difficult. It's harder for fathers to feed the baby and to be that involved. For example, if you're breastfeeding, especially in that first time when that baby is neonate and you are feeding them continually, it's a lot harder for the dad to be able to participate in that, unless, once again, you're pumping and arranging for that to occur. Infectious diseases transmitted by mother. In a lot of these places throughout the world, you might have things like HIV, tuberculosis, West Nile virus. All of these things can be transmitted through breast milk. So in certain situations when there is infectious disease present, then breastfeeding would not be the best choice, because you can transmit that disease to the baby. And we already talked about these marketing claims by formula makers. We didn't actually. I think we'll get onto that in another slide. I'll briefly allude to it right now. What happened was, yeah, we did talk about it a little bit. What happened was that these manufacturers put out false claims that the formula was better for your child, that basically you're a bad mom if you're going to breastfeed them. And so they went ahead and put all this out there. And then what would happen is people in these developing countries that did not have access to clean water would mix their formula with dirty water or contaminated water, and then give that to their babies. And of course, the baby would end up getting really bad diarrhea, getting sick, and dying. So worldwide, less than 50% of infants are breastfed for even a short while. Benefits from breastfeeding for just a few days. When you first start to produce milk, the mom produces something called colostrum, and this is in all mammals. This colostrum is a thick, yellow, kind of sticky substance, kind of a thick milk, and it is very high in protein, very high in antibodies, and it gives a burst to the immune system. So if somebody can even just get that colostrum into their baby, it gives them that immune boost. And that's really the biggest thing, is that immune system boost. And this is present for the first few days is all. And then after that period of time, there's no more colostrum. It's just breast milk. Some cultures believe that colostrum is bad for babies because of the texture and the color is different than normal breast milk. Some cultures believe that it's bad. In India, there are areas that give honey and butter mix instead. They express that colostrum, get rid of it, and start after that. But we know through science that colostrum is super important for babies. All right. The benefits of breastfeeding for developed versus developing countries. In developed countries like the United States, breastfeeding has relatively small benefits. What we mostly see is kids with reduced gastrointestinal problems. Yes, there is a boost in immune system and all that too, but these are small small factors, small correlations. We have vaccinations to boost the immune system also. So we have access to better health care. The babies who are breastfed have lower incidence of gastrointestinal problems, and our vaccinations really help with that. So the benefits that we see are kind of small in the United States or developed countries. However, in developing countries, it is really important to promote breastfeeding. And this is mainly because a lot of areas of the world do not have access to clean drinking water. And what happens is formula is mixed with unsafe drinking water and the babies die. 1.5 million babies die annually due to formula use with contaminated water and no vaccinations. And this is information from UNICEF, and you can look all of this up in your book as well. This is a little graph that your book had in there. This is the percentage of infants exclusively breastfed at 4 months of age. So by 4 months, let's see, more than 80% in China. We have Chile. Those are the, well, Chile is the only one more than 80%. China is 60 to 79%. And we have some of these other places. And the United States and Canada, we're looking at 40 to 59% breastfed at the age of 4 months. In other words, from the beginning to 4 months, are you still breastfeeding? That's what this is saying. And let's see, Mexico, we're looking at 0 to 19%. So, and you can see a lot of these areas where the breastfeeding is not really occurring at 4 months of age. I already talked about the obstacles to breastfeeding in developed countries. The bigger problems are lack of adequate milk production, baby does not latch on, common with low birth weight babies, work, strain on the mother. Moms, when they are breastfeeding, it is a round-the-clock job with no breaks. That baby needs to be cared for round the clock, and when you're breastfeeding, they will breastfeed more frequently. And they take smaller amounts more frequently, whereas with a bottle, they'll take larger amounts less frequently. It minimizes the father's participation and less pumping. We already talked about that. Obstacles to breastfeeding in developing countries. Once again, same thing with lack of adequate milk production. Baby does not latch on well, common to low birth weight babies. So those two are the same. The other things that we see is that infectious disease, those rates are much higher in developing countries. We do have those problems here as well, but they are much higher. There's a much higher rate in developing countries. HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, West Nile virus, and those things are transmitted through breast milk. So that would be a reason to not breastfeed the baby. Once again, to recap, the biggest problem with breastfeeding in these developing countries was a marketing campaign based on false promises that the formula was better for your child, cleaner for your child, more healthy for your child in general, which are false claims. UNICEF, World Health Organization, and 20 agencies altogether are working to educate women around the world about the benefits of breastfeeding. What happens is that a lot of these, they're working with hospitals across the world, which is great. However, the majority of these births for these people that are lower socioeconomic status from these developing countries have their births at home. So outreach to villages and things like that is a little more difficult to do, but it is being worked on. And once again, the big risk is that these people are mixing this formula with water that is contaminated. Now we're going to move on to the social and emotional aspect of the neonate. Neonates need protection, nutrition, social, emotional care. Protection because humans are born pretty darn helpless. We're not like a lot of other creatures, even the apes, they come out a lot more developed than we are. And a lot of that is because, as we have talked about, the skull has to be kind of squishy in order to get out, because we're going to have these giant brains. So we have these very big heads. So we have to be born earlier. We're not quite as well baked as a lot of other mammals. So That being said, our infants are super duper helpless, so they need constant protection. Nutrition is important. We've been going over nutrition. Once again, I want to emphasize that the formulas out there are super healthy, super good for your kid, and you're mixing it with good water, you're good to go. That child is going to be healthy and well, just as a mother who is breastfeeding. Social and emotional care is what we're going to talk about now. Having a baby is a major lifestyle change for parents. If parents don't have a lot of social supports, it is very difficult to care for an infant, especially if it's a single mom or single dad trying to care for an infant without a lot of support. Crying and soothing. Newborn babies cry, poop, sleep, and pee. That's mostly what they do, and they just look cute. I mean, you know, once they get unsquishy. So there are three different types of crying, three main types of crying. The first is called fussing, and that's a softer volume, unsteady whimper. There's pauses, and it can be thought of as a warm-up cry. That's that, you know, just kind of little cries. No, the heart's not really into it. Anger cry is a large volume of air. They take in a large volume and they wail quite loudly. They cry loudly and put a lot of air through their vocal cords. So oftentimes the fussing will then lead up to this anger cry. The next type, the third type, is pain. A pain cry is sudden onset. So the baby will go from being perfectly fine to all of a sudden start crying. It's sudden onset. There's no fussing before. They kind of hold their breath, like if you get injured or something happens immediately, the breath is held and then a big cry comes out, a big loud wailing cry comes out. There is also basic or frustration cry. So if it doesn't fit into these three little things here, we can call it a basic or frustration cry. If the baby is hungry, wet, soiled, tired, uncomfortable, hot, cold, any of these things, they will often cry. If you take care of that issue and then they continue to cry, it's probably in one of these basic or frustration cries. So, and sometimes babies just cry when you can't figure out why. We're going to take a look at the crying curve, which relates to crying frequency. Across cultures, patterns of crying are similar. At 2 weeks, they're not crying quite as much. At 2 months, babies are at the peak of how much they're going to be crying. And then 4 to 5 months, that crying pattern decreases. Now, each baby is born with their own little temperament. So some babies are just super fussy and cry all the time. They would be up here in this 5 to 6 hours of crying a day, which is, you know, kind of nightmarish for parents. Some babies are just so laid back, 20 to 30 minutes. Thank you. I was so lucky. My kids were just laid back little people. Well, my son was a little bit more in this middle area, a little fussy because he was colicky, my youngest son. And we'll talk about colic in a few minutes as well. And this pattern is what we see across culture. This seems to just kind of be a biological pattern. And then in the first month of life, infants often cry for no apparent reason. And that's really important to know, that sometimes, you know, you're doing everything right. You changed them, you fed them, you burped them, everything, they're clean. I mean, and you're like, I don't know why they're crying. So people have just worked on different methods that will soothe their children. And they learn quickly, parents learn quickly what soothes their individual child. Soothing and responding to cries. So now we've talked about the different types of cries. Well, what do we do about it? Okay, we've already changed them, we feed them, we do all of that. There are variations in the duration and intensity of crying. So duration of crying would mean how long they cry. Intensity of crying is how strongly or loudly they cry. And then we will also be talking about frequency of crying, how often they cry. So Swaddling is one way that has been shown to reduce crying in babies that are crying kind of for no reason. We don't know why. 10% of Western babies are colicky with no known reasons, and colic is, we'll talk more about colic on another screen, so we'll come back to that. So there are different ways to soothe your baby. You can lift them up to your shoulder, walk around with them. They like repetitive movements like rocking, swaying back and forth. They like soothing sounds. Sometimes a baby might like a recording of a babbling brook or waves. Something like that might calm them down. Distracting them with a toy or something like that. Taking them for a car ride. There are a lot of different things. The common theme for crying and soothing is giving that baby a new source of stimulation. So kind of taking their mind off of it a little bit. As I mentioned before, the initial pattern of crying is similar across cultures. The frequency of crying is similar, so how often they do it. What we see that is different between cultures and between traditional cultures versus Western cultures is we see a difference in duration and intensity of crying. US babies are often left on their alone, on their own. So they're left in their crib by themselves or put in their room. Their crying tends to be longer duration and more intense when compared to babies from traditional cultures. US babies can have up to 15-minute crying spells just for no apparent reason. Oftentimes, a philosophy within the United States is to let the baby cry it out. All right, and these are different, and there's different reasons why people try this. Traditional cultures, babies would help. Babies are either held all day or with their mom all day. So oftentimes, a mom will have that baby strapped to them, so they're carrying them, or the baby will be left in the care of another woman, an older woman usually within the culture, or one of the children, one of the older children will take care of that young child if mom is doing something that that baby can't be with her. The traditional cultures don't let their babies cry it out. They just respond right away to the cry and figure out what it is. They have shorter durations of crying, and they rarely have incidents of prolonged crying. Oops, I didn't get the color right on this. A couple of studies on crying, Small, 1998, compared Korean moms with American moms. And some differences that they saw was that the Korean moms responded immediately to the cries, where the American moms let them cry it out or spend more time alone. The Korean moms held or carried their infants 2 times longer during the day, so they had less time alone. The Korean moms, we saw a shorter duration of crying. So they might have had the same frequency, so the baby would start crying just as much in both cultures, but in the Korean culture, the baby only cried for a short period of time, where in American culture, the baby would cry for longer and more intensely. So the American moms had the longer duration of crying and more intensity. And what they've noticed in this study was that it appeared to be that increased carrying and contact with the baby seemed to be what may be making the difference of how much this baby is crying, or the duration and the intensity of the crying. Another study done by Hunziker and Barr in 1986 was done using American moms. So what they did is they took 2 groups of moms. One group was instructed to carry their babies for 3 hours a day and to keep a log or a journal of the baby's crying. Group B was not given any special instructions, and they were also keeping a log or a journal of the baby's crying. What this study found was that the frequency of crying was the same for both. In other words, you know, baby cried 10 times during this period of time in both groups. However, the duration was less than for group A. So group A was the group that carried the babies for 3 hours daily, and this this group of babies cried for a shorter duration. So they only cried for a little bit when they started crying instead of a lot. And of course, this has implications about whether or not you're carrying or holding this baby more. Swaddling is one way to soothe infants. Swaddling is an ancient tradition. We've seen it for at least 6,000 years. We have documentation of it for at least 6,000 years. Here is a depiction of a Navajo baby who is swaddled on a traditional backboard. And this backboard, moms can just strap that on their back or carry them or whatever, and they're strapped down to this board and they're snuggled in really tight. This seems to help soothe crying. Once again, 6,000-year-old practice. Swaddling fell out of favor in Western cultures in the 17th century. It was thought that that was just cruel to swaddle that baby and snuggle him up really tight. They also felt that it was going to hurt the baby's limb development and such, whereas it turns out not to be true. Research has shown that the swaddling does not harm the baby in any way, and it is a factor in helping to soothe babies. Some babies really respond well to being swaddled. Other things for soothing is offering a breast or pacifier. Sometimes the baby is just fussing or carrying on, and in a traditional culture, the baby will be offered the breast. They may not be hungry, but they may just suckle anyway, just to soothe themselves. Whereas in Western cultures, we might give them a pacifier for the same purpose. We already talked about lifting the baby to the shoulder. Sometimes a warm bath can soothe the baby, or taking them in a stroller, rocking them, going into a car and going for a drive around the block. There are very high cry babies that are more difficult, that sometimes people have said, oh no, I just got to put them in the car, go for a drive till they go to sleep. And so people have been a little bit creative in how to soothe their babies. And of course, soothing sounds. Other notes on soothing. There's been a big debate as to whether you should ignore crying or respond right away. Is it a good idea or bad idea to ignore crying? It doesn't seem to impact development too much as long as the baby's needs are being met. So as long as that baby's getting changed, getting fed, getting an adequate amount of attention, then it doesn't seem to be a lot of difference. Research hasn't shown a lot of difference between whether or not you're letting that baby cry or not cry, with the exception of what we talked about already. One of the issues with this crying and not crying debate is just that the argument for not letting them cry is that attending to their needs right away reduces that duration of crying and that sort of thing. The other side of the coin, by letting them cry it out type of philosophy, is that if you pick up that child every time it cries, that baby every time it cries, then it's going to learn that if it cries, you'll pick it up. And that is the downside of that. So those are kind of the two different sides of the argument for whether it is a good idea or bad idea to ignore crying. I mentioned colic earlier. Colic is primarily seen in Western cultures. It's not seen a lot in these traditional cultures. And I would be curious to know if that had to do with diet as well, because what the mom is eating in the Western culture is going to be very different than what they're eating in a traditional culture, and what I'm eating, my baby is eating. So the colicky babies, we say that it's like the 3 threes. If the baby is crying for more than 3 hours a day for 3 days at a time for 3 weeks or longer, then we say that that baby is suffering from colic. We don't know what causes colic. We do know, however, that there is a correlation between colicky babies and maltreatment. So babies who are kind of this high maintenance, crying and fussing all the time, parents are tired, they're exasperated, especially if it's like a single mom trying to take care of this baby. So it is a risk factor for maltreatment, because parents can get to a point where they're just overwhelmed. and maybe not take appropriate action with the child at that time. So getting good social support is really, really important. Having a friend or somebody or a partner that can help with this baby is really important. Okay, bonding, myth and truth. So in animals, for example, geese, Konrad Lorenz found that he did this study with geese, and he found that the geese would imprint, as soon as they hatch, they will imprint on the first thing they see moving around. If it's your dog, this goose is going to think the dog is its mother. It's going to imprint on this. And in his study, the geese imprinted on him, and he became the goose mom. And it was believed for a long time that humans imprinted in this same way. There is actually no scientific support for this idea of humans imprinting. So that is kind of a myth. However, bonding and spending time with that infant is important. So the good thing that came out of this concept, out of this misconception, is that a lot of hospitals encouraged close contact immediately after birth because they believed that this baby needed to imprint on their parent. And it turns out that that wasn't true. However, a lot of good policies were put into place with the parents being able to interact with that baby right away and, you know, spend time with that baby right away. So that was a good thing that came of that. And bonding with your child is important, but there is no like critical bonding first hours thing going on. There's no imprinting. All right. That being said, and we are going to look at bonding and social interaction and how important hands-on social interaction, talking to a baby, all that is in our next chapter. We'll be talking about that. Postpartum depression is a type of depression experienced by new parents. It is mostly seen in moms. It is marked by overwhelming sadness and anxiety. This sadness and anxiety will interfere with your daily functioning and interfere with your taking a shower, getting dressed, caring for your child at times. You may not have it to the point where you're not caring for your child, but it may affect at least your self-care. 9 to 16% of moms experience postpartum depression within the first 6 months, and the peak is at 4 months post-delivery. With moms, we think that this has to do with the fluctuation in the hormones. In developed countries, 7 to 13% is kind of the range that we see of postpartum depression. In developing countries, we see a very wide range of percentages for postpartum depression. For example, Nepal, 5% moms experience postpartum depression, whereas in Guyana, 50% of moms experience postpartum depression. Dads can also experience postpartum depression. They're not having those hormonal changes, but what they do have is a really severe, not severe, but a really dramatic change in their lifestyle, in their relationship with their partner. All sorts of things change, and that can lead, and the lack of sleep, all of these different things. 4 to 6% of fathers in the US suffer from postpartum depression. Okay, causes of postpartum depression, mom's hormonal changes, lifestyle changes in the mom, and then dad, those lifestyle changes. Risk factors for postpartum depression: lack of social support, becoming overwhelmed, economic status, lower, money problems. Those are also risk factors. That increases the amount of stress that the mother is having. Psychopathology, if the person's already suffering from anxiety, already suffering from depression, bipolar disorder, some other type of psychopathology, it increases the risk for postpartum depression. Also, if you had postpartum depression with a previous pregnancy, it increases the likelihood that you'll have it in your next pregnancy. Genetic predisposition. So we've talked about genetics a little bit. You may have a genetic predisposition towards depression, towards bipolar disorder, towards schizophrenia, some other psychopathology. Oftentimes, this genetic predisposition will not be expressed until you are under stress. So stress is a major cause of this postpartum depression. If you have already a genetic predisposition to depression and you are under stress with your newborn child, it may trigger that to express and you may have postpartum depression. Poor partner relationships are also a risk factor. Treatments for postpartum depressions, there are treatments. Psychotherapy works really good. There are several different types of psychotherapy. Talking to a therapist and working out something that will work for you with your therapist is a good way to start. Antidepressants, depression medications may also be an option. If you are breastfeeding, taking an antidepressant may not be an option for you. But if you are bottle feeding, you may be able to take an antidepressant as well, if that's what's determined by your psychiatrist. All right, estimated prevalence rates of maternal postpartum depression for 28 developing countries. I'm not really going to go over this. You can just see that there are some wild variation to these things. 44% in Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe 33%, Guyana is the highest at 50%. So there's a wide variety or a wide variation in the percentage across the world. All right, so that will do it for this lecture. I hope you have a really good day. And let me get back to our screen if I possibly can. All right, and that is it for us today. I hope. All right. Once again, I could not find the doggone button up here to stop recording because I have to go into this other menu. This is just not user-friendly, really. Anyway, you guys take care. Until next time, bye-bye.